Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. On behalf of the conference committee, we are thrilled to welcome you to the second day of the International Conference on Photography and Education at the European Cultural Center. The initiative started last year in collaboration with Blurring the Lines, a platform for fostering talent and networking in visual culture that receives the precious support of Paris College of Art, Urbanautica Institute, Photodoc, and our host, the European Cultural Center. I hope that many of you attended some of the panels yesterday. It was an excellent opportunity to listen to fresh and committed points of view about visual culture beyond geographical borders and educational systems. I was particularly impressed by the engagement of younger generations on ethical and sustainable issues and how photography has been a powerful tool for language to use some of the adjectives that were used yesterday for social change. I want to take this opportunity to thank our partners, the speakers and panelists, the conference team, and the audience for coming in large number despite the current challenging circumstances. We had over 100 participants yesterday, and we hope that today's lineup interests many more. What a year, 2020. I'm not going back to what happened to us, right? But as an educator, I feel today more than ever profoundly concerned with what we call education. I see the urgency in fostering and promoting any model of education to make a better world. For this reason, the conference committee decided on photography and education, formal, non-formal, and informal as the conference theme for 2020. We hope that this conference content will encourage many of you to feel committed and grateful for education in a more general context. Photography education has come a long way over the years. Photography evolved from science to art in a century of existence, providing its artistic merit over great debates about its technicity, communication, transformation potential. From the real to the virtual, new uses of the medium have quickly emerged. Multiple ups and downs accompany them, blurring of the boundaries between information, advertising, artistic creation and production, the regulation of markets, industrial and economic logics, which makes the productions of amateurs and professionals a profound change in the field. In today's world, where we are overconnected, subject to a contact flux of images, photography seems to be an alternative, an attractive medium, and a necessary field to discuss the features, advantages, limitations, and interrelations of education. Photography can develop many skills and capacities, of course, stimulating self-reflection, critical thinking, promoting creativity and personal sensitivity, social cohesion through collective reflection of society issues. It encourages also tolerance and defends humanism values in order to foster citizen expressions. With that perspective, the visions, the provocations, and the stimuli that come from students and scholars represent an essential source for understanding the complexity of the world we live in. Please allow me to do a short detour through history. The 1960s was a period of high growth for both the economy and education worldwide. There was an emerging analysis of what was seen as a world educational crisis. For instance, in the United States, education policy became a passionate debate topic during the decade for two primary reasons. The first one, it was closely related to one of the decade's prime social movements, the fight for Black Americans' equal rights. And secondly, the government refused to offer funds to private and parochial schools. Many countries in the world were finding very difficult at the same time, politically and economically, to pay for formal education expansion. Around the same time, the UNESCO moved toward lifelong education and notions of learning society, culminating with what we call the 1972 report entitled Learning to be the World of Education Today and Tomorrow, that actually put forward the learning society concept. The UNESCO state members were asked to reorganize their educational structures on two fundamental premises. The first one, all agencies become providers of education. And the second one, all citizens be engaged in learning, taking full advantage of the opportunities provided by the learning society. This, of course, is also lifelong learning was to be the master concept that should be shaped educational systems from them till now. What emerged was the precise tripartite categorization of learning systems, a statement that comes from the work of Combs with Prosser and Hammett. There was formal education, informal education, and non-formal education. Formal education was understood as the hierarchical structure, chronological graded systems, education systems that run from the primary school to the university, and including, in addition to a general academic studies, a variety of specialized programs and institutions for full technical and personal training. The informal education, the truly life learning process whereby every individual acquires attitudes, values, skills, and knowledge from daily experience and the educative influence and resources on his or her environment, from family and neighbors, from work and play, from the marketplace, the library, and mass media. And non-formal education is any organized educational activity outside the established formal system, where operating separately or as an important feature of some broader activity that is intended to serve identifiable learning clienteles and learning objectives. In other words, formal education is related to schools and training institutions, non-formal with communities, groups, and any other organizations. And informal covers what is left: interactions with friends, family, colleagues, and other type of people that we interact with. Today, for the second day of the conference, we want to take you on a journey that will consider two aspects. The first one, the educational learning settings of photography. We will discuss photography as an educational system with its formal, non-formal, and informal aspects. We will address its transition from one system into another and suggest the best models to succeed. We will discuss geographic and socioeconomic inequalities and access to education, the role of photography to promote gender, or a greater equality in educational process, and second, the professional learning settings in which photography and entrepreneurship meet, and the impact of new education systems on younger generations. Through case studies, we will understand the development of soft skills as a force, the importance of engaged institutions that develop strategies and opportunities to mentor photographers into new business models. And I hope you will enjoy all these different case studies that will be proposed this afternoon. There will be a time for Q&A at the end of the morning and afternoon sessions. And you are welcome to ask your questions through the chat. And I'll be passing on your questions to our panelists, to our guest speakers at the end of the session at 11:40. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Pedro Vicente. He'll be talking about the real decisive moment, online methodologies in photography education. Pedro Vicente is the director of the master's degree in photography at ELISAVA, Barcelona School of Design and Engineering, and SHIFTA Online School of Digital Makers by ELISAVA. Welcome, Pedro.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and thank you. Good morning to all, and thank you to Klaus, to Steve, to the ECC, and the Blue in the Lines, and everyone who has been involved in the organization of this fantastic conference and event that I was lucky enough to be last year in Venice in the same conference, and now virtually sharing with you this some thoughts. I'm going to share my screen, so I start my presentation. Just give me 1 second. Yes, so as Klaus said, I work in Barcelona, in Spain, and I am the director of the MA in Photography and Design at ELISAVA, and also of an online MA program by SHIFTA, which is the online school by ELISAVA. So I want to talk about these new possibilities and this new way of learning and teaching that we have in front of us, especially because COVID-19. Until last year, just a few of us had experience on online teaching. Now, today, I think all of us have some experience on online teaching, either because we are teachers, but also because if you are a parent, if you are kids, you probably had to do online learning with your kids. So approximately 9 out of 10 students worldwide went into online teaching, and so teachers. So I think from that point of view, this is the starting point, and probably this COVID pandemic has developed 5-10 years the online teaching methodologies and also the learning. But I want to take a little bit to the past and take a very extremely quick history on distant learnings. The first distant education course was in 1840s by Sir Isaac Pitman, who taught a system of shorthand by mailing text transcribed into shorthand on postcards and receiving transcriptions from his students in return for correction. The key element of this system was the student feedback, which was, as I said, crucial innovation in Pitman's system. And also, it was impossible because the introduction of uniform postage rates across England in 1840. Similarly, today, online education is possible because internet. The first full degree at university was by the University of London in 1858, which became the birthplace of long-distance learning at undergraduate level, allowing students to study at the same time than making their living, and also not having to go to London to take exams. And I take from here to 2006, where Salman Khan founds the Khan Academy. You know, the Khan's Academy is a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, with incredible facts like it is used by more than 100 million people every year. They have 99 million lessons delivered, and it is available in 190 different countries. Another key moment in the online distance learning is when the MOOCs, the massive open online courses, appeared in 2008, and when they became very popular in 2012. So this is just to have a little background. So distant learning is nothing new. It's nothing that happened or appeared with the pandemic, but it has more than 150 years, almost like photography, you know, a year after. So how is distance learning now? Just a very quick and simple definition. Distance learning is a way of educating students online. Lectures and learning materials are sent over the internet. Students work from anywhere at any time and not in a classroom. Distant learning falls into two main categories: synchronous and asynchronous learning. Synchronous learning refers to a method of education delivered that happens in real time, and it requires live communication online. And it is less flexible, as you know, we are now doing a synchronous lecture, as you see what I see, you hear what I say in real time. Asynchronous, on the other hand, is where students receive clusters of weekly deadlines. They have the freedom to work at their own speed. Students can access course content beyond the scheduled meeting or class time, and both, and this is very important, both faculty and students benefit from the flexibility of asynchronous learning, as it allows them to create and consume content when it is convenient for them. Some pros and cons of distant learning. Obvious: study from anywhere at any time, cost less expensive, flexibility to choose, the global benefit does not follow the one-for-all methods, is less tiring and boring, fast and easy sharing of resources, easy access, earning while learning, money and time savings, adaptability and freedom, and some of the cons is that maybe that learning style might not suit all. The need of being self-motivated. Students can lose easily track of deadlines and motivation. There is no physical interaction with teachers or students. Some difficulties to stay connected at all times. Technical difficulties, and difficult to choose a quality educational program. Some facts before the COVID-19, a year before, in 2018, this is the facts from the States, there were 20 million people doing undergraduate courses. Out of them, almost 7 million were doing at least one subject in a distance education system. So that was the 35% of the students were doing at least one online or distance learning unit, and 16% were doing exclusively distance education courses. It's quite also interesting that you see the type on the left, the type of the institution. For private, for-profit institutions, this is completely the opposite. It was 73% of students were doing at least one online subject, and 62% were doing exclusively distance education courses. Some of the reasons for choosing online learning is that the main one is not having time to go to classes. And the less important one, which is also relevant, is the reputation of a specific school is just the 8% of the reasons. Average of people wanting to follow a unit or to do a course through mobile devices, 46%. And some of the fields of study in undergraduate distance education, as you see, arts and humanities, only 10%. Quite interesting statistics. How far do you live from the closest campus service center of a college university in which you enroll? And this is for online education. Under 25 miles, 45% of people who enroll in an online course were enrolling in universities or institutions under 25 miles away from home. So how this has COVID changed and shaped distance learning? That's some of the facts that most of the students, after experiencing the online learning or distant learning, were much more motivated, and 60% of them were looking forward to follow and continue their studies through a distant learning system. From the other side, as a teacher, what has pleasantly surprised you about online distant learning? The most popular one was innovation, freedom to experiment with teaching practice, which is it's quite shocking. So that means that in a on-campus teaching, we don't innovate and we don't have freedom to experiment with our teaching practices. The same we can apply to flexibility, to the wide range of tools that we have. It looks like from on-campus, we don't have that range of tools, or we don't have flexibility or accessibility to other platforms and materials. It's very focused on the physical scale. Some facts after COVID: 77% of educators believe that online teaching learning is just as good as traditional learning, if not better. Nearly 70% of all students claim online instruction to be as good or as better than in a traditional classroom setting, and 26% of online students claim to learn better online than in a classroom. So, from my point of view, it has become more than evident that approaches to teaching and learning in higher education are being transformed in response to multiple factors, but particularly in reference to new pedagogies and new technologies. Digital methodologies and strategies must allow to experiment and develop new teaching methods, improving interaction with the students and promoting collaborative learning and self-learning. The uses of technological tools and application must allow and support the application of digital methodologies and strategies. In an on-campus teaching model, a lecturer is a lecturer because he has a particular knowledge in a particular field. In distant learning, having knowledge alone is not enough. It's not anyone can have it. And knowledge is anyone. Distant learning, a distant learning lecturer needs to know how to transmit and communicate knowledge to the students, to engage with them in a distant format, and needs to have several advanced digital skills and to face new challenges. In my opinion, these are some of the skills and challenges that we as teachers, educators, have to face if we want to go, or if we want to have the distance teaching. It's like obvious digital literacy, communication and digital environments, the creation of innovative digital content, security in digital environments, problem resolution, digital technological innovation, motivation techniques, social media skills, create visually engaging content, we face digital native students, need to be always updated. The fact of having passive students in our virtual classrooms, the lack of interaction, among many others. But in my opinion, it is much more than just about technology. Technology is just the beginning, it's just the principle. As teachers, we need to update constantly not only our specific photographic knowledge, but our skills, methodologies, strategies, and ways of engaging with the students and their changing environments. Knowledge is not enough anymore if we don't know how to transmit it in a very engaging way. And I think this is one of the keys of online or distance learning or teaching, engaging with students that are not with you, that you can't be in the same room at the same time, and engaging with them through distance, both spatial and temporal. In a global world, it does not make any sense that the learning of photography continues to be limited to the decisive moment. To learn in a given space, at a given moment, with a given teacher, in a given context, and from a given way of understanding photography. Today's students must grow professionally and learn in a global and constantly changing environment, and learning and teaching models must adapt and update to that environment. So this is how I see some facts about photography distant learning. We have to, first of all, we have to distinguish between non-formal education, short courses on photography, the thousands of them. This is just one example in Coursera, one of these platforms where you have 104 courses on photography, and formal education, under and postgraduate education, which is also growing very, 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 very fast. And 3 years ago, we decided in ELISAVA to create an online school that is named SHIFTA, with this to start exploring and making and having and putting on the market new programs based on distance learning. These are some of the points of the philosophy or characteristics or methodological points of SHIFTA, that we do a synchronous and asynchronous model. Study flexibility online. The students can study whatever, whenever they want. There's global and accessible. Online students are supported by virtual learning environment that can easily be accessed via computer, tablet, or smartphone app. Learning by doing methodology, high quality online teaching, lectures, and digital resources developed for us and only for us by industry leading academics. We have a personalized monitoring of students with live feedback sessions. The resources and activities of each module are designed so that students are able to develop their full potential and go further independently. Active participation is essential to create the appropriate space for collaborative learning. Evaluation is continuous, combining active participation and individual or collective work. All assessments are taken and submitted online, and important, students get the same degree than on-campus learning. And going into the detail of how do we face distant learning, photography, distant learning at SHIFTA, some of the key aspects of our philosophy. is that we do online presentations and lectures to introduce key concepts of photography, both synchronous and asynchronous formats, small group, and class discussions to encourage peer interaction and collaboration. Online critiques to test the students' projects and ideas, practice-based workshops to help students to develop practical, technical, and team working skills. It doesn't matter if it is a distance learning program, we still do practice as you could do it in an on-campus program. We have online resources, monthly master's classes, independent study is crucial in the program, and obviously the online campus 24/7. And some of the methodologies that, or online methodologies that allow not only an experiential learning model based on practice, but also based on innovative learning systems that promote active and collaborative learning, combining diverse methodologies in which students are the core of learning processes, and promote transversal work methods to train the new generation of photographers in the context of the digital society. So, or some of our methodologies, how we do all of this. We do it with project-based learning, competency-based learning, flipped classroom, design thinking, gamification, cooperative learning, communication and feedback, and micro-learning. I'm just going quickly through each of these to explain a little bit what they are. Project-based learning is a teaching method in which students can gain knowledge and skills by working for an extended period of time to investigate and respond to an authentic, engaging and complex question problem with change. This in photography education is something that we all do. We work through projects and we work with projects, and the learning and the teaching are based on the projects. Competency-based learning is a framework for teaching and assessment of learning in an educational setting. It is also described as a type of education based on predetermined competencies, which focuses on outcomes and real-world performance. We try to do all our projects, everything, all the briefs we give to the students, they are based on a professional basis and close to them. The flipped classroom is the pedagogical model where students encounter new information and concepts outside of class and spend class time developing their understanding by engaging with and practicing what they learn. In this model, students are transformed from passive learners to active learners, taking a high level of initiative and responsibility for their learning. Class meetings are for the most valuable opportunities for teachers to guide students by helping them increase their learning by offering useful feedback. So what we do here is maybe the opposite of what we have been doing in traditional teaching. The students, they have to study, they have to look at the materials, and they have to study the lesson, if you like, before they come to class. And in class, with different methodologies and strategies, we fix and we complete what they have learned by themselves. Design thinking is also another of the methodologies that we use. It's a mindset, an approach to learning, collaboration, and problem solving. In practice, the design thinking process is a structured framework for identifying challenges, gathering information, generating potential solutions, refining ideas, and testing solutions and learning from mistakes. Design thinking, we could say, is the core structure of how we face online photography education. Gamification is the application of game design elements and game principles in non-game contexts. It can also be defined as a set of activities and processes to solve problems by using or applying the characteristics of game elements. We use different apps that are based on games to do that. And I'm just finishing. Cooperative learning is the process of breaking in a classroom of students into small groups so they can discover a new concept together and help each other learn and to develop ideas and collective projects. Also very important. Communication and online meaningful feedback is critical to distance learning. Methods of communication include verbal, written, and video electronic exchanges at different times in different platforms. Distance learning feedback also performs some additional specific functions as students are less clear on what it is expected from them. Feedback should become a constant dialogue between the student and lecturer. And this is, for us, so crucial to have a constant dialogue between us. And the last one, microlearning provides relevant information to the students in an exciting manner by dividing the course material into small, manageable portions for an optimal learning experience. It is a straightforward and easier strategy to acquire knowledge, allowing learners to grasp bite-sized information quickly and effectively. So, and this is my last slide. As a kind of a conclusion, we need to view distance education from multiple perspectives and with questioning attitude. The challenge is to recontextualize, restructure, and significantly reshape teaching and learning to provide accessible and flexible learning opportunities to any student, while continuing to offer a quality experience that is also cost effective for a mass market. We as educators must critically analyze new developments in online learning and begin to position ourselves for the inevitable transformation of how we approach learning in a distance education. It is time that educators think through the challenges, changes, and possibilities of both flexible access and collaborative learning experiences. And this is it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pedro. I think it was interesting to hear that, and I guess that is maybe I hope that we will have the time to discuss a little bit about the online program, online degree that we've been discussing with Steve as well. And I think you somehow put a very interesting concept and maybe a frame to discuss this a little bit later. I want to introduce our second speaker, so Steve Bisson. So Steve Bisson is also the co-founder of Blurring the Lines, and we start this journey in 2014. It's been a long way. So Steve, his talk is entitled New Scenarios in Image Making Education. Is there anyone out there? Steve Bisson is the founder and director of Urbanautica Institute. He's also a curator and a publisher. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Klaus, and good morning. Thank you all for attending my speech and, of course, this conference. As well introduced by Klaus at the start of this morning session, this year theme concerns different and possible declinations of the education with regards to image making practices. Before starting, let me quickly switch my virtual background and using this image. I'm not in a bus station, as you see, but I'm now in a simulacrum, basically, in which you can hear my voice and see me, a projector image of me, actually, overlapping with an image I took a few years ago while I was waiting for the train in a little town called Castelfranco, Veneto. So I chose this image as a background because it portrays students after school waiting to go home. And this image lets me to reflect on the boundaries of education. Where does education begins and ends, right? Klaus was very clear when he stated this definition about what education, formal, non-formal, informal. It's about the boundaries again. Is it within the walls of our institutes? Or is it out there in the streets, in the stations? Or is it in our smartphones that we all look more and more obsessively, like these guys behind me? I don't have a definitive answer, but in my speech, I will try to illustrate you my thesis on this subject. Understanding the meaning of education in today's image-making world is essential to better focus on the scenario in which we work as educators, or that we want to learn as students, or again, that we might want to put into practice as professionals or researchers. But above all, this is crucial because we are all producers and consumers of images. We all know this, right? This scenario in which we move has changed radically and rapidly in recent decades under the ever-growing progress and pressure of technologies. Pedro Vicente had just made an interesting lecture about the power of technologies. To sum up this scenario, we can imagine our grandfather, or maybe, in my case, great-grandfather, maybe 100 years ago, right? 1920. And let's try to ask ourselves a question. In a time when there was no internet, television, smartphones, tablets, computers, how many images could our grandfather ever see? I have given myself a simple answer, and this is it. Today, we can see more images in one day than our ancestors could ever see in their entire life. So, we are faced with a scenario characterized by the enormous boundless production of images, of which we are certainly consumers, but also creators, producers, makers, communicators, influencers, scholars, experts. But there is a but, and this is my thesis. In this present scenario of incredible availability of images that has no equal in the history of our species, we are less and fewer educators. Having said this, you may be wondering now, but how is this possible? There are universities, there are schools, training courses. Yes, it's true. But in most cases, these teach us how to use technologies. Or, in the best cases, they teach us how to design or to tell, through technologies, our stories. Or, more, to communicate them through technologies. In a word, let me say that they teach us to become brilliant or fair storytellers, or to pursue an artistic career with awareness, or to be a decent entrepreneur in a competitive and complicated visual making world. Yet, if all this is true, then why I'm telling you that in this scenario, conditioned by an overwhelming production/consumption of images, there's a huge need for educators. Why? Well, the answer I gave myself is that we are deliberately ignoring the phenomenon, or at least we are underestimating it. Because of the urgent issue we face as a society is no longer just about the consequences of this huge availability of images. What we have to ask ourselves is how this scenario influences our habitat, our habits, our preferences, our choices, our lives through images. Let me explain better, because this is a delicate passage of my thesis. The difference with our ancestors, our grandfather, right, from the 1920s, is not only that today we are exposed to many more images than in the past, or that we can use different tools to produce them in such a convenient way. I'm afraid it's not as simple as this anymore. The scenario has become much more dramatic for the combination of two anthropological and social phenomena that occurred in the last, I would say, 20 years. It's a very short period of time, 20 years. Remember that organic species in nature evolve slowly. It's never an instant process. While the changes that I'm going to tell you about have happened at a speed greater than our ability, not just to adapt to them, but to understand them. And of course, this immediately raises another question, radical, and I would say almost ontological, because it concerns our posture in the world. And the question is, how can we teach a phenomenon if we do not have the time to understand it? This question, of course, has no definitive answer. What then are these two phenomena? They are both related to the fact that today, humans more and more think and express themselves through images because of technology. Today, we are here, connected from all over the world through extraordinary technologies, which allow you to see me better, to see an image of me, and to communicate with me, or rather, to communicate with an image of me. I understand that today this might seem pretty obvious, right? Especially now during the COVID-19, which forced us to change our working habits and beyond. But what we should not forget is that important distinction between me and the image of me. So what we are experiencing, probably without fully realizing it, is an evolutionary process happening in our brain before than our body. Certainly accelerated by the pandemic, but still in progress with our history of an instrumental animal that uses tools to progress. Modernity, of course, has just pushed fast forward this long-term process of 1,000 years, dating back to our origin. So let's try now to imagine for a minute an opposite operation to the one I suggested at the beginning of my speech. Think of having a person here from 200 years ago. What would he think of us? I'll tell you. He won't be able to believe what he sees because of his world, or rather, his vocabulary, his mental and therefore visual boundaries. Do not contemplate what he sees. He cannot accept the new reality except by trusting his own madness. For him, it's probably like accepting a war or a big trauma. Very difficult. It takes time, and the result is never guaranteed. With this regard, let me remember a story of an elderly lady, very kind, of rare emotional intelligence. It happened about 20 years ago. She once told me that when the early telephones were released, she couldn't answer the phone. Better, she refused to do it. She felt very uncomfortable with that. And you know why? Because she did not believe that the voice coming out the phone was real. Attention, this might sound funny, huh? Okay, today, but I invite you to reflect upon a fact. What Granny didn't believe in was not so much the existence of the voice, but the fact that a machine could speak for that voice. This is radical. The fact that technology could have a human form. This takes me back to what the German philosopher Heidegger had already intuited and formulated in the 1950s. on a very specific thought device known as language speaks. What he reminds us of important is that we speak through words that we have not invented, and thus we are spoken by the language, and not the opposite as most people think. And this is also more interesting if we consider our times, because if the language becomes that of technologies, then we are spoken by technologies, or machine will speak for us, like now. And this is exactly what scared the old lady. I know it's getting a little complicated, right? But please be patient, because now comes the interesting part. If language becomes an image, or better, if the image becomes the preferred medium of the language, and if we become our image, our avatar, our second life, our Instagram profile, our Facebook cover, our online portfolio, then it means that images speak of us, and above all, before us. If this happens, then by paraphrasing Heidegger, we can state that we are spoken by the image, or we are spoken by the image we built of ourselves to please the audience. And that today more and more coincides with those likable images that others have of us. Briefly translated, we cannot speak through images anymore. Or we can do it, but mostly the audience of our spectacle will not care. The great ease with which today we can undo, build, modify, integrate the image of ourselves is an absolute novelty, a page that was never written in the evolutionary diary of our speeches. But above all, it comes with deep consequences. So the two phenomena, namely the fact that more and more machines take on our appearance, our voice, our image, our desires, along with the other exceptional fact that we are less and less able to distinguish what we are from the image we have built for ourselves, and finally that all this happens at a faster rate than our ability to understand the consequences on us and our environment, make the whole matter of extreme urgency. Furthermore, if the cyber era changes the way we relate to people, things, and the cosmos, then an ethics of gaze, of looking, becomes the necessary thinking device to face our time's greatest risk of confusing reality with an image of reality. Because the human, rather than actively seeing, then prefers to be passively seen. Again, if true, we need to reverse this perspective and teach visual makers and ourselves new responsibilities inherent in the act of looking, and consequently in the way of taking/making images. I believe that the first step would then have to be learning how to distinguish what is significant from what is pointless through an ecology of seeing that is based on a true consciousness of who and where we are. Let me go further with my thesis, saying that this is a problem that affects us all, and with respect to which schools would have to play an important and decisive role. As I said at the beginning, we are all potential producers and consumers of images. Therefore, there is a huge need for new professionals, for new educators, capable of addressing different target users of images in society, primarily the youngest, who are the most exposed to the risk above mentioned. We, therefore, need schools curricula capable not only of training brilliant storytellers and creatives, of cultivating their talents. We must respond to the growing need for professionals able to interface with a completely changed scenario, and to then be able to interact with other fields and disciplines. Because, as I just said, images are overlapping and substituting reality. We need new active subjects, new pedagogical practices, new skills, circumscribed in a new ethic of looking. Probably, if we succeed in this, the photographer of the future will look much more like a visual anthropologist or a sociologist of the image. Or maybe we need to coin new words to describe our new skills. When a word like photography contains too many things, then it loses its usefulness and meaning. Therefore, the path of dialogue, comparison, deepening started with blurring the lines network is only the beginning. We face a wide open window on an unknown prayer. Together, we can find best practices to turn what appears to be a threat into a great opportunity. In the last decade, through my curatorial practice, I've tried to walk this virtual prayer that has become our favorite game. A bit like a pioneer who doesn't quite know what awaits behind the hills, I took a step inside and began to explore. I found this game to be a great learning and relationship possibility. So I started experimenting, planning initiatives that were thought fecundate in the game, but which then sprouted into reality. Here, I just want to mention 4 of these experiments because they identify 4 potential directions of action. The first one, with Zero Fotografia, a photography workshop on the agricultural landscape hosted by Benetton Foundation in the small village of Zero Branco, I tried to bring together photographers, cartographers, landscape architects, urban planners, geographers in a single format. The result was formidable. The added value from the interaction of different knowledge was extraordinary. Today, this methodological approach is the basis of most of the publications I work on. So, the concept of a photo book, for me, is now outdated. The future is the convergence of knowledge. Either we teach photographers to dialogue in this sense, or they will be useless atoms in a society. The second project, an experimental direction, concerned a survey on public space in the city of São Paulo, Brazil. I transformed an artist's residence to which had been invited by the FAP University of São Paulo to create a platform for dialogue between artists, filmmakers, photographers on a theme of the extreme privatization of space in the city that reduces the possibility of a collective experience. An experience lasting over 4 years, exhibited finally at Galleria Virgilio. This made me realize the importance of an anti-colonial approach in curatorial practices and of the involvement of local artists who otherwise would not have had a similar chance. Third direction, with an almost opposite method to the previous one, I brought together creatives from various parts of Italy's universities and foreign countries in a small semi-abandoned village in the northern Italy. The aim was to make these artists interact with inhabitants for over a year, organizing monthly public meetings and exposing site-specific works. Through this process, I understood the importance of bottom-up participation, but also of how there are people willing to give hospitality to artists and provide them with support. I understood how this type of exchange brings oxygen in and ideas into small, close, and difficult realities. Of course, I also realized that if there is no motivated local administrations, everything vanishes quickly. Finally, the experience in the last 5 years with the Synapse Collective, a group of Italian photographers committed to the environment. I understood how by overcoming an egoic vision of art and embracing a shared, extended, and collaborative practice, we can address issues that seem too big for us, such as having carried out a survey on over 30 environmental worst-case scenarios, I would say, or having studied several national and regional parks simultaneously. To summarize, an interdisciplinary look, a true local commitment, bottom-up approach with citizens, collective practices, these are directions that offer a different opportunity for the future, and that our students have to face already within schools. But let me tell you that most of these opportunities need money, right? And we have heard yesterday how difficult, hard it is for artists, photographers to make their living out there. So maybe we should also take care of this in school, teach our students how to become entrepreneurs of themselves, right? And getting to my conclusion, photography is not dead. Whoever says or writes is, as the grandfather of 200 years ago, is completely lost. Human history is a history of tools. It's up to us to govern them. We must provide society with other skills. There are no other solutions. The current education system faces a great challenge. It may decide to face it, as we tried with this conference, or it can choose to find itself out of the game. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. I think it was interesting to hear about the new scenarios because it made me think about, I don't know if maybe we could consider these scenarios like something global and local issues that we were just discussing yesterday with some of the panelists, and how maybe sustainability and ethical concerns should be part of the curriculum from now on, you know. And I think it is important what you put out there that, I mean, that we should go beyond the technical skills and students should get more than that to become a successful photographer. So I think we will have a lot of things to discuss later on, and I hope that we will have questions in that sense. I would like to invite our third speaker. Let me just, put it here. John Fleetwood, welcome. I'm really happy to welcome John because, as I said at the beginning, the conference committee decided on the theme, but what I forgot to say was that the theme also was inspired by John in a conversation we had with the curators of Blurring the Lines, and we were thinking about education as a formal system, and then John actually shared with us the situation in Africa and especially in South Africa, and how non-informal systems are part of the way that photographers get trained there. So thank you, John, for that, because I think it was a very good inspiration, that we got from you, and then thanks to that we kind of like put together this this conference today. So John is going to be talking about the end of the line, how photographers become. John is a photography curator, educator, and the director of photo. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you all members looking at us, those that we cannot see. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to the questioning section. I suppose the foundation of my discussion today is based on my experiences as an educator and a curator in photography. First, as the director of the Market Photo Workshop, and currently with Photo. The Market Photo Workshop is a school gallery and project space for photography based in Johannesburg. It's in existence since 1989. It was founded by David Goldblatt. In the 14 years that I was the director, the development of the organization occurred parallel with the development of the curriculum of the school. And for the last 5 years, I was the director of photo, where my interests have shifted, working more strategically with emerging photographers and photography networks and institutions across the continent, across Africa. Photo is a multi-operational platform for the development and promotion of socially engaged photography practices, photographers, and critical visual culture. We're based in Johannesburg in South Africa, but I'm talking to you from Maputo. Can we say that in response to many technological changes that shifts photography as a medium, and more importantly, that shifts the practices of photography, that photography learning is an ongoing and lifelong experience? In the last 2 or 3 decades, photographers had to reposition their practices in thinking about a changing role and nature of photography, as did the generations before them, I'm going to share some of the critical decisions we had to make to develop learning and public programs that I think can benefit our discussion. And even though these are based within South Africa and in the larger continent of Africa, it always strikes me how similar these discussions are. I suppose the first question is, what kind of photography education is most appropriate and necessary? And over the time, it became clear that non-formal education can better perform to the interests of an individual student or photographer and the community that they operate within. I think it is quite critical to start to think around photography, not just as an act of a photographer, but perhaps something that's a communication between a photographer and a larger community. For the purposes of this presentation, I would like to define formal education very similar to what Klaus had done in the beginning. I thought that was very helpful. So I would like to define it as an education with a formal, repeatable curriculum that is structured and accredited by education regulators, whereas informal education can be seen as education without a structured curriculum that occurs more in an ad hoc way. And of course, non-formal education, perhaps of those in-between spaces of these informal and formal education words. Having some structure, perhaps, non-formal education is not defined by it. It's determinedly allow for the dynamic of change. So I have got this interesting question for institutions of photography that are teaching photography. And it's interesting because how long does it take to become a photographer? How long does it take to become an artist? And I think that is the first question that we had to consider when we started to think around photography institution in South Africa. Can we say that it's 2 years, 3 years, or can we say that it is lifelong? And in particular, in the context of South Africa and Africa, but also in the context of the world, we need to understand photographers as ongoingly learning. And so at best, what photographers gather at the time at the academy is getting introduced to the tools and concepts so that they later can understand how these change. What photographers would need as they develop their careers is a community to reflect with and upon their engagement. And we need to create spaces for that. And so this idea of creating a community of photographers, perhaps for me, is the essential element of thinking around photography education, of thinking around arts practice, but also about a larger conversation about what it is that photography does. How can we consider the idea of ethos? In spaces of non-formal education, is it not easier to speak about the spirit or a culture of community that is manifested in some attitudes and aspirations? Have our formal education formal education institutions become institutions of power that respond to authorities and regulations of government policies that uphold privileges? Those are some of the questions that we asked. Central to the idea of teaching photography in South Africa was to speak to the history of representation and the ethos of education. What is the role of photography in an unjust society, and how can photography education address and redress these conditions? So recruitment of photographers from excluded communities can be one way. These photographers brought work from their communities that otherwise would not have been seen, or that otherwise would have been photographed by outsiders, with the complex questions around representation. Recruitment is not only around the students. Recruitment is also about the exclusions of who is teaching, who is speaking. And in today's session, I see in the spaces up there all the white men. And so how can we break the insularity of photographers to include other knowledge producers? This is what Steve had just spoken about. Often our gatherings of photography are just for photographers. How do we address, for instance, issues of environment, social concerns, when we are not in the community? As decolonial practices have found ways to rethink the role and practice of photography in Africa and elsewhere, new generations of photographers have become, by the nature of their work, historians, sociologists, and have used their practice and work as a way to reposition these knowledge fields. How do we include knowledge experts in our education as part of our community? How do we understand vertical learning and the space for it? I think there's a lot of criticism about vertical learning, the idea of somebody that speaks down to photographers. That's not what I mean. What I mean here is mentorships as a critical part of learning. It's not just to get information from somebody that has gone through the process before, but it is to direct and personalize a process of learning how to conduct ourselves. It's about setting up relationships with somebody that you know has experience and take you seriously. And I think sometimes we underestimate the inclusion of established and experienced photographers in our courses. Horizontal experiences between peers, colleagues, people who can share their experiences, people that share daily similarities in their challenges and how they overcome, who can share equipment, who can share skills, who can share information. Diagonal experiences, learning in and from the community. It is only by being with certain communities that you can share and engage. And most importantly, where you learn to self-position, especially understanding your own privilege and the paradigms that come with this. So much of our knowledge about race, gender, sexuality, environment have been debunked. We cannot learn to be an artist without empathy, without knowledge, without engagement. How do we cultivate this in the classroom? I want to show you some, if you allow me, just a second. Let me just try this again. Sorry, guys. Right, so we're going to go doing it this way. So Photo is the current organization that I'm working with and that I'm heading up. You can find us on phototool.co.za. One of the first things that we had done was to start to do a survey of photography education initiatives on the African continent. And what we have seen is that many of these institutions do not exist as institutions of space, but often exist as institutions of personalities, of individuals who drive and make things possible that otherwise would not be possible. And it's these energies that accumulate into institutions. And they're all over the continent that I think that these institutions started to develop. We did a research of about 140 institutions that we found through internet and through our knowledge of the continent. And we shortlisted about 40 institutions to look at their curriculum, their premises, the kinds of students that they recruit, the lecturers, trainers, the people that teach. And from there, we set up a very basic information schedule of about 15 of those institutions. This we did in around 2015. In 2016, we started to develop an organization, which is still running today, which I think is a great initiative that I really think is something very similar perhaps to Blurring Lines in the way that it shares information. It's called the Centers of Learning for Photography in Africa. It's a network of independent education initiatives across Africa. And these institutions are based, as you can see, and I'm quickly going to introduce you to some of them. So I'm based in Johannesburg, so photo, even though I'm not currently in Johannesburg. There's Market for a Workshop, a very well-known institution that I was previously the director of. But then there are institutions all across. There's, for instance, the Nele Institute, which is a photography platform for learning. Very similar to this is Associação Auger, which is in Cabo Verde, with a very well-known program called Cachupa Factory. There's a Contemporary Image Collective in Cairo, which has got an incredible history of developing visual culture and public debate. And then there are organizations in Kigali, for instance, the Kwanda Arts Foundation, and very recently the Kigali Photo Festival, that are kind of emerging organizations that develop. There's also spaces that just give infrastructure, like Espace Photo Partage, which is basically a premises where photographers can come and learn from each other. And so this map, or this group of people, indicates the members that we currently have. We communicate by WhatsApp, we've got monthly WhatsApp meetings. But we also started what I think is one of the most important mechanisms for discussion. And this is the CLPA News. It's a newsletter that we bring out every so often. In the past, it was every 3 times a year. In 2019, in 2020, in the year of COVID, unfortunately, it was only once. And this was the newsletter dealing with COVID. So what it shares and starts to share are these kind of concerns that we are all aware of. So these would be the contributors to every newsletter. We ask contributions from the different institutions, and we invite every time another guest editor. In this case, it was Jacques from Rwanda, to work with us in Johannesburg to develop this newsletter. And then what we do is we put together information through interviews, speaking to people. And in this last issue, we looked at the influence of COVID on the future of photography. We looked at the future of education, and we then asked all the people to give us some feedback and put that together. And this was the idea of future of our platforms. And so the newsletter becomes a space where we can exchange ideas and start thinking around how we can share as different institutions. We had tips for online educators that previously was mentioned, for online learning. I think one of the really important aspects everywhere around the world is this idea of how we are emotionally affected by the conditions of COVID, and how we are affected by this idea of online learning, learning from each other, often in very difficult situations, particularly in Africa and in South Africa, was the question around internet access. And should we not see internet access as a human right? The newsletters also have got a little bit of gathering of what the learning and teaching activities are of the different institutions, just so that people are aware of what other institutions are doing. We can see here everything has been postponed. I'm showing you some, maybe I wanted to just speak about this photograph first. It's a great image by Mauro Vombe that was, of course, photographed before COVID in 2018, or it might have been 2017. He's the most beacon photographer. But we felt that it was quite apt to use this photograph to kind of show the density and intensity of how we gather so regularly and as a way of contrast to COVID. But so each of the newsletters deals with different kinds of subjects and different ways of thinking around photography. In 2019, we had a feature on gender binaries in African photography, and we looked at how those gender binaries express themselves in photographs, in exhibitions, and often in very difficult spaces across the continent. I love this photograph because this was one edition that dealt with gender as well. It's the image of Joao Lubembe from the DRC, from Democratic Republic of Congo, which is exactly some of the concerns of the continent. Who is sitting in front of the computers and learning, and who are taking photographs of whom? And so I thought this is a very interesting way of starting to look at how our industries are still very much affected by sexism. This is the outcome of one of the projects that Photo had done in Ethiopia as a way of public engagement. I'll speak about that just now. So these are all different newsletters, different contributions. Very similar to what Steve had discussed earlier, I wanted to quickly speak about the 10 Queer project. It's a project that Photo had done in 2018 around queer social practice. And the idea was, how do we get people together relating to the question of knowledge production if only photographers come together? So what we had done was, sorry, it seems my computer is not moving fast enough. So what we had done was to invite five experts, writers, sociologists, anthropologists, artists, to come to speak to 5 photographers or image makers in a 2-week program where they gathered around to do a project. And I think the very important aspect of this project was that people were able to share critical information in the group, but also be part of this very intimate exchange of 10 people. And I think that this idea of having small interactive processes with people of different fields of knowledge is becoming very critical for our futures. This is some of the exhibitions that we have staged in different places, and also as a way of trying to think around different communities and how one can involve communities. So this was an exhibition in Cabo Verde, in Mindelo, where we used these very basic posters on the floors as people would walk by to kind of interrupt their daily life, but also to get photographers to start to interact with broader public. This is something very similar in Ethiopia, a little bit more complicated in terms of the regulations that are happening there. But I think it was an incredibly important moment to start to interrupt this idea of public image with the idea of social media. And you can see it's kind of low technology processes, which I think had great benefit, again, to people working together. The current project that we are doing is a project in Maputo, where I'm currently in, which is about the idea of getting people to produce new work so that we are able to see this work perhaps in public, but that we also start to think about invisibilities. So part of the curriculum has got to do with the complicit notion of representation, has got to do with the rejection and erasure of people and communities, and has got to do with invisibilities. That's where I'm going to leave you. Just want to show you the group of people that I'm working with over the last week, and I will continue to work with the next week. I thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, John. You said something very interesting about empathy and engagement and how we should cultivate this in a classroom. I think about it. I will ask you again this question maybe during the Q&A. Okay, I'm gonna welcome our next speaker. Lucas Pandolfo is gonna be talking about deconstructive approach, the educational benefits of contextualizing photography. So Lucas is a filmmaker and image maker, and he's also a faculty member at Paris College of Art. And also he's one of the finalists for the 2020 edition of Blurring the Lines. Welcome, Lucas.
Thank you, Klaus. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for those who are joining us this Saturday morning. So as Klaus said, my name is Lucas Pandolfo. I'm an artist and filmmaker, and also currently an adjunct professor in both the photography and foundation departments at Paris College of Art. And I'm here today to present my talk, Deconstructive Approach, the benefits of contextualizing photography, in which I basically I mostly base my thoughts on the experience I had of teaching a quote unquote experimental class at the start of this year. So today, as some of the other panelists have said, there's an overabundance of images in the world. And this, of course, poses new questions to the education of fine art photography. So this abundance can be said to stem from the availability of a virtually infinite array of machines from which to create images with today, as well as the accessibility to creating images these devices have generated in the last 2 decades or so. So these different formats of today, such as the smartphone or the DSLR, even other more unconventional cameras, were of course not available in the formative years of photography, when the history of the medium and its pedagogical methodologies were still being written and photography wasn't as accessible as it is today. So my talk discusses how contextualizing photography and also its tools can be beneficial to students if we consider how each of the frames and formats available to image makers today and in the past as well can be deconstructed. And as I said, I mainly base my claims and thoughts on a class co-taught with Professor Kendall Rofe and myself in the first semester of 2020 at Paris College of Art. And the name of the course was Alternative Image Making, as we attempted to take an alternative approach to the curriculum that we saw. So today, photography is no longer an isolated field as it was in the past. So images are now part of our daily lives in ways that seemed unimaginable when the medium was first conceived. And photographs are also now part of installations and films. And as we can see, they're being seamlessly integrated into contemporary art today. So the approach to teaching photography must, of course, evolve based on how the medium has changed over the years and has also become more accessible to both amateur and professional photographers and image makers. Because cameras are, after all, tools. And these tools vary as much as they do in size as they do in function. So these different devices, of course, open a lot of possibilities for play. So it is important not only to understand how they work, but also how to decode each of them. So the Czech philosopher Willem Flusser writes in Towards a Philosophy of Photography, and I'll quote him here, that the encoding of technical images, however, is what is going on in the interior of this black box, the camera in this case, and consequently, any criticism of technical images must be aimed at an elucidation of its inner workings. As long as there is no way of engaging in such criticism of technical images, we shall remain illiterate. So Flusser's quote, and of course his whole book, along with an attempt to complement a photography curriculum that already had classes focusing on its history, of the history of the medium, and of course the necessary technical skills for its practice. So these two reasons were the main inspirations for the structuring of the syllabus for alternative image making. Because when working with a concept, a narrative, or a subject in photography, it's not unusual that the format or the camera or the frame is found or applied after the idea is conceived, so as if to fit the subject. But we wanted to ask that me together with Professor Kendall Rofe, what if the knowledge of how a camera works and behaves, together with the knowledge of the different contexts images have been used and are being used in today, could inspire the conception of new projects? So this was the question and the main idea of alternative image making, to go the other way around and propose an experimental class that asks students to consider formats and contexts before their subjects. So the course lasted for 15 weeks, and as I said, was co-taught with Professor Kendall Rofe, who took over its practical part, which focused on teaching students about alternative analog processes, both in and outside of the darkroom, while I focused on the theoretical side of alternative processes, both analog and digital, which are the part of the class I'll be focusing on today, to talk about how students responded to deconstructive ideas and approaches to photography. And more precisely, I'll be focusing on 3 lectures that I gave during those 15 weeks. So camera formats and their influences on the image, which will be the first one I'll be talking about. Then film and photography, differences in editing, and to conclude, vernacular photography. So the course Alternative Image Making focused on deconstructing the systems of the image and also decoding their tools. So this curriculum started with a discussion of 2 chapters of Willem Flusser's book, Towards a Philosophy of Photography, which I quoted a bit from. And more specifically, the 2 chapters, the technical image and the apparatus, which in ways served as the backbone to the first lecture and also to the structuring of the syllabus. So Flusser's book was published in English in 1982, and it takes an approach very opposite to what the semioticians were doing at the time. For example, like Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida, which I believe was published in 1980 or 81 in English. So he takes a very opposite approach to what they were studying at the time. So not one photograph is mentioned in the entirety of the book, which instead focuses on the inner machinations of the image and the program of the camera which produces them. So Flusser, just for a bit of context, so Flusser sees the technical images in contrast to traditional images, which would usually be paintings or illustrations. So he sees them in contrast as technical images being images that are made by apparatuses. So here are the tools that are used to create photography, such as the camera. And apparatuses on their turn are machines or black boxes, as he puts it, that have a text or a program that controls them. So to Flusser, technical images are images made by text because they are made by these cameras, which are programmed by a company or a brand or someone in particular. So therefore, it's important not only to read images, but also the tools that make them. So in the first lecture of the semester, students were shown different camera formats and brands ranging from well-known analog formats like 35mm or medium format to more recent ways of making images like smartphones, as well as more unconventional cameras like webcams like we're using right now. So the focus here was to base the lecture on the idea of Flusser's program and to see these cameras through his eyes and through his perspective. So to start, the students were shown different camera packages and asked to discuss how the brand's packaging influenced the images taken with such camera, or if they didn't influence them at all. So surprisingly, when asked what they use more well-known cameras for, like for example, the Fujifilm Instax, most of the students had actually similar responses, like taking pictures of family, friends, or at parties, for example, which are all situations that are advertised in the camera's package. And meanwhile, when they were asked what they used their DSLRs for, the answers were much more open, just as the way these cameras are usually packaged in black or white boxes that have little information other than its technical capabilities. And for most cameras discussed in that lecture, students were shown both how the camera was or is advertised, together with how artists or professionals are using it today. And this proved useful because it showed how the tools used by photographers always have a program behind them, and as Flusser says. And it's important, and it's up to the artist, and it's important for them to decode the format in order to either follow its command or to subvert it. And this was Flusser, this was what Flusser was talking about when he mentions that if we do not decode the tools of photography, we shall remain illiterate. And in another lecture, which focused on the differences between film and photography, students were shown how the difference in time between the two mediums deeply affects the way they are perceived by the spectator. So this was important because it helped them see the place of images, not only in the world, but also in the psyche of the spectator. So the class started with a discussion of Christian Metz's article, Photography and Fetish, and every class of each week always started with a discussion on a text I found important for their learning. And Photography and Fetish by Christian Metz puts in perspective the contrast photography has to film when we look at their relation to duration. So basically what Metz says is that photography has no duration, while duration in cinema is set prior to the viewing by the filmmaker. And this, of course, has a lot of consequences in the two mediums and how they relate to the spectator. So throughout that discussion, students were asked to apply elements present in cinema like genre, continuous editing, and duration, which are not present in photography. And they were asked to try to apply that to photography in an open discussion. And this was useful again because it made them aware of the constraints and the freedoms in photography and how they can work around them, or how they have to work around them to actually get their message across. So it was important throughout the course that they understood how photography worked both for the author and the spectator. So they were more well aware of how the medium was actually read and how they could successfully employ these tools to create a story or to get a message across. And finally, so the final lecture I'll be covering in this talk focused on vernacular photography, which aimed to show yet another side of the medium, that of artists using images that are already available to tell a story of their own, but also not necessarily. And this was important because, as I said earlier, and also some of the other panelists mentioned, there is an overabundance of images today. And through vernacular photography, we can raise questions about authorship and ownership of the work, and also explore ways to maybe tell a story that is already out there with images that have been taken in the past by other photographers, and sometimes even anonymous or amateur photographers. And so at the start of the class, we actually discussed an article on how the aesthetic of Walker Evans's work could be considered vernacular, even though he was taking the pictures himself. And at the end of the class, we had an exercise that combined previous discussions in the editing of images, like we did in the previous lecture I covered, with the use of printed images that were sourced by the students. And these ranged from family photos to postcards they found at flea markets. And the exercise helped them put themselves in the place of the viewer who has to make sense of a collection of images which may not be thematically or visually linked, but once it's put in the same place, they actually have to make sense of that collection of images. So through seminars that aim to look at still and moving images from the perspective of alternative processes and deconstructive readings, alternative image making was sort of an experiment in reversing the pedagogy of teaching photography curriculum that I had the experience of learning from when I was a student. So the teaching of technical skills is, of course, very important to the education of photography, but it's already part of most curriculums. So alternative image making sought to be a response and as well as a complement to a traditional photo curriculum, and of course did not aim to dismiss these courses which are so important to the education of new photographers, along with courses on the history of the medium as well. And for the classes, the course's final project, students were asked to actually create a proposal for a project based on one or more of the concepts dealt with in class. And this, of course, aided me in assessing what the students had garnered from the discussions and the classes, along with allowing me to test the hypothesis that through decoding and deconstructing photography as Flusser did, and by mixing a seminar approach with a practical one, I could help students understand the work they were creating, as well as showing them how the knowledge of the systems of the image can be beneficial to the reading of the work. And I can say, and I believe that results to this approach were positive, and deconstructing the systems of the image and its machines proved to be effective in making students think outside of the box and also employ their techniques in a deeper way. Students responded well to the discussions, and also most of them were engaged throughout the course. So through this experience of teaching, which was actually my first class, I believe that teaching photography today should include ideas about aiding students to navigate these muddy waters today that separate images from photographs, as well as feeding them the knowledge to separate the two along the way, and to contextualize images in a better way, and to understand what the role of the image is today. So I believe that also decoding the systems of the image, both for the author and the photographer, can help students see their work in a deeper way. So to conclude, I believe that today's teacher should act like a cartographer in ways, and always be knowledgeable of changing terrain. Our job is not only to show how it is done, but to teach students how to find a way to navigate the universe of the images themselves, so they can better understand the place of their work in and out of the art world. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and also for the opportunity, and I'll be happy to answer any questions later at the Q&A session.
Thank you, Lucas. Yeah, you received some questions that we will send you over once we have our last speaker.
Okay.
So
Great.
On that note, I would like to invite Maria Jose Bello. Hello, Maria Jose. Nice to meet you. Nice to see you here. So Maria Jose will be talking about photography pedagogical project in the Museum for Memory and Human Rights. She's a professor of film and audiovisual studies at the University Austral of Chile. So I guess that is the middle of the night for you.
It's early in the morning. It's
Early
7.
in the morning. Okay, that's not too bad. I hope you had a cup of coffee. So I'll let you just start whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm very happy to join you to join this conference. I am connected from southern Chile, Valdivia, and I will present a pedagogical photograph project that is part of my PhD research. And I will talk a little bit about the theoretical framework of this project and then about the practical work we did with young people in the Museum for Memory and Human Rights in Santiago. So images play a fundamental role in comprising the territory of memory that approached Chilean dictatorship, which was held from 1973 until 1990. And the portrayal in the media of the historical trauma had led to political violence was based on the use of documentary material. Photographs, reports, newspapers, videos, documentaries, posters, and so on. But how were these images communicated? And the question was, is it possible to think of a way of seeing that distance itself from an objective documentary logic? What is the role of images within a pedagogy of memory? This photography pedagogical project is part of a research which took place from 2010 to 2016. And the work in the museum with the youth was the result of an initial exploratory phase during which contact with the institution was established. In this first stage, the images that make up the museum's visual culture were analyzed, as well as the notion of memory that the museum was producing. At the same time, an inquiry was made into the pedagogy the museum was developing in an effort to learn about the role of images within this practice. The theoretical framework of this project is built on the need to define a pedagogical and artistic work related to memories of the Chilean dictatorship with young people situated in the present. The starting point has been a perspective that perceives memory not as a concept or accumulation of facts and stories about the past, but as an act situated in the present and expressed in embodied subjects. Ball points out that cultural memorialization should be understood as activities that occur in the present, in which the past is constantly modified and rewritten, and that these acts related to the past and inscribed in the present are in turn shaping the future. Ball emphasizes the active and performative dimension of these acts of memory. Cultural memory is not simply something that one carries, but something that one acts. In this sense, for the author, memory should be seen as an active and cannot as relegated to a merely individual scope. The need for a second person to act as a witness to a painful and evasive past confirms that memory cannot be confined to individual psyche. Rather, it is formed in the culture where the traumatized subject lives. The notion of memory acts related to the perspective of Jelin, who understands memory as a transformative task. White talk about memory as work as a defining feature of the human condition, puts each person and society in an active and productive role. Each person is an agent of transformation, and in the process, they transform themselves and the world. Activity adds value, referring then to the fact that memory implies work is to incorporate it into the task of generating and transforming the social world. Additionally, the project is rooted in the confirmation that the reiterative use of spectacular, violent media images about the past has led to a certain indifference or anesthesiation of shock on the part of audience. For Frankel, when pain becomes a spectacle, communication is no longer effective. Therefore, Frankel asked, how would it be possible, whether at an individual or institutional level, to go beyond the narratives of the victim or a perspective based on guilt? She proposed that the solution is the creation of museum stories based on uncertainties, narrative openness, and dilemma, which according to her is not easy to achieve, given that museum culture does not tend to construct this type of narrative. El Tit wrote an article where she criticizes what she calls the images of dismemory. In regard to the scenes of La Moneda in flames, shown ad nauseum on broadcast television, the author says, "It seems impressive to see the violent onslaught of flames through the powerful concrete blocks. It is repeat incessantly. Some images that seem, how to express it, slightly oversaturated, excessive, unfocused. For Asolai, a photograph is always the product of an encounter between the photographer, the subject, and the camera, and therefore can never belong to one single person or one single narrative. It is an object that is out there, and thus anyone can pull on one of its threads and arrange it in such a way that the images can be reopened to renegotiate what it shows, and possibly change everything that has previously seen in it. In this way, the photographic image is inscribed in the present. It is developing and becoming something. Carrying out research based on photographic narratives created by the young participant would therefore permit a reactivation and expansion of the contents and ideas of the exhibition, without the need to intervene through collaborative experimentation with this type of images. Frankel analyzed how pedagogy should be conceived in an anomalous place of learning, such as a museum about historical trauma. The author highlights the paradox that we continue making ambivalent efforts of approaching what cannot be spoken. She coins the notion of difficult knowledge to refer to themes such as the Holocaust, slavery, AIDS, or apartheid, where it's easy to fall into attitudes of mere compassion towards the victims. As a solution, she proposed developing strategies that would promote knowledge based on uncertainties and dilemmas. Certainly, she urges us to put a new emphasis on museum spaces based on the value of ambiguity and in the distinctive to end stories. This incentive, to end stories. To achieve this, an effort must be made to abandon a series of ideologies and rethink the power relationships that they established. The concept of post-memory, defined by Hirsch and later taken up by Viñas, introduces the idea of thinking about memory in a relation to different generations. The act of work of memory would have the capacity to confirm, update, and recreate connections between young people and history. Hirsch used the term post-memory to designate the second generation, that of the children of the victims, and how they relate to their parents' experiences, which they only remember as stories and images they grew up with. At the same time, these experiences are so powerful, so monumental, that they become memories of their own. In this way, they acquire a quality of the present. The author explains that post-memory is not a position of identity, but a space of remembrance. This space is created through acts of cultural and public remembrance, identification, and projection, more than through individual reflection. It is about adopting traumatic experiences, consequently the memories of others, as if they were your own, to see them as experiences that one could have and incorporate them into one's own life story. The fieldwork with the youth took place during the month of January in 2013. 11 young people between the ages of 14 and 17 signed up for the workshop. And during 10 4-hour sessions spread over 3 weeks, they worked intensively to produce photographs and visual narratives. Additionally, 2 museum guides and 1 external assistant professor contacted by me participate in the workshop. In what areas would each participant contribute to the learning process? I, as the professor, photographer, researcher, prepared the visual examples, the research time and technical materials, and mediated the creative and dialogue process. The youth participants create images based on their tours of the museum, their visual culture, and their life experiences, based on the photographic content given during the workshop laboratory sessions, as well as their unique manner of being in front and behind the camera. The museum guides contributed the detailed knowledge of the museum space and participate in dialogue and debates. by giving a more institutional perspective. The assistant professor complemented my role with an emphasis on solving technical problems. During 3 intense weeks, we dedicated ourselves to spending time in the museum, walking corridors, staying silent, taking photographs, expressing our emotions, creating and debating in a space of freedom and respect. We were willing to analyze complex relationships and investigate a living and embodied experience of memory, understood as something that we activate in each encounter, in each image, in each word. The basis of the workshop was the following: walk, see, create, and share. What happens when post-memory youth walk through the museum? How do those who were born in democracy view the past? How do the dialogue with the images how do the dialogue with the images and stories of the exhibition? What images challenge them? What images are missing? What kind of future do they propose to build? The methodology of the workshop had the aspiration of collaborative and horizontal work with the young people. However, it was also based on the idea that creating images does not happen out of nowhere in a cultural vacuum. There are cultural and imaginary references that are at play. We had to define strategies in order to achieve the type of images that could connect with the museum from the subjectivity of the participants. The visual artists in the area of memory who served as reference for the research are Doris Salcedo, Christian Boltanski, and Lori Novak. They have investigated through the creation of images in their relationship with situations of political violence in different national contexts. The works of these artists allowed me to see that the construction of open visual system can effectively create new conceptual connections related to time from the present to the past. There were 3 other artists that I chose, not because they were linked to themes of memory, but because the methods of photography seemed to me to be resources that lent themselves to the exploration of the subjectivities of the museum. A training on self-portrait, which I attended in Barcelona with the artist Cristina Núñez, the work of the artist and educator Wendy Ewald, and the work of Gillian Wearing, were all fundamental for this project. So my photo in the museum was the first project we developed with the young people, and as the participants signed up for the workshop, I contacted them by email to ask them to send me 2 photographs, one family photograph and one photograph that says something about them. Once we met, we projected the photographs and each participant explained to the group the photographs they had sent and why. Once in the museum, each one of the participants had to choose one of the 2 photographs, and during a free walk through the museum, about 45 minutes, put their image somewhere within the permanent collection that caught their attention to take a new photograph where this relationship would be expressed. The photographs acquired new meanings and generated other relationships once in contact with the cultural material of the museum. The pedagogical objectives of this exercise were following: to encourage an initial tour of the museum focused on the subjectivities of the participants without a guided tour, to explore the connections that were developing based on with their images, what arose and what affected them during their visit, to redefine the visual and written documents present in the exhibition through the creation of new images, to deterritorialize the images of the museum by taking them from an historical cultural reading to a re-reading based on subjective itineraries. Self-portraits were also very important in this project. During the planning of the visual methods, I gave a central place to the self-portrait because I decided that a research project focused on self-portraits should begin after visiting one of the exhibition part, which is called La Geometría de la Conciencia by the artist Alfredo Yar. Upon leaving this space, the participants note feelings and questions that had come up after their experience in that place. They then went one by one into the photography studio, which we installed in the guide educator room, where they had 15 minutes to take self-portraits using a self-timer based on the ideas that they had noted. In the studio, there was a small blackboard and chalk, so they could write concepts, sensations, or questions about their work. The objective of this project was to release, explore, and transform the sensations provoked by the work through the creation of images, to use the body as an expressive material, to capture the temporary, the ethereal, the fleeting, the theatrical, the unrepeatable, and the spontaneity of gestures, to discuss the possible feelings of Jar's work through new images that emerge in the self-portrait. We then, the next day, we continued with other projects, self-portraits, where they could also bring things from their home to do this in acting. The idea was the participant could repeat an image that they had taken for the first self-portrait, focus on a specific topic, or make visible another aspect of the work. They would no longer work from spontaneity as in a first impression, but rather from imagination. What do I want to show and how can I achieve? And before doing this second part, we review like a story of self-portrait in photography, so they can have also other reference. The objective of this second self-portrait project was to dilute the limits between fiction and reality, to condense feelings through the use of rhetorical figures, such as metaphors and allegories, to explore the possibilities of acting and performing to communicate about historical events. The next project we developed was the mapping of the museum journeys. One of the purposes of the project was to find out what moments or images of the museum would arise from the viewpoint of the young people. To approach this topic, one of the visual research projects consisted of mapping the subjective journeys of the young people through the museum space. The objectives of this part were to highlight the elements of the exhibition that stood out in the eyes of the young participants, to create a map that could resist narrative linearity, to observe also synchronicities and dissonances in the image of the youth, to make visible topics or spaces excluded in a standard visit of the exhibition. We then continue with another self-portrait project. This was not foreseen in the initial planning of the workshop. It came about as a result of the success of the self-portrait activity among the participants. And for this reason, I proposed that they interpret characters, that they look for characters or some important people that were shown in the museum that make sense for them to represent. So the objective was to work based on the participant wishes, curiosity, and imagination, and to discuss the historical role of the chosen characters and their importance in the fight for human rights in Chile. So some of the photographs of resistance were in act, appear several times in their portraits. Also, they talk about the repression of artists, about women that were tortured. Here's also the role of writers, and Pablo Neruda was interpreted by Camila. And the last project was called, was about objects. So we also saw some reference about the artists that use objects not only in photography, but in general in history of art. And this was to talk about how would they complete the museum exhibit. So the idea was also to talk about what was shown and what not shown and what they thought it was important to have in this exhibit. The origin of this project resided in a problem detected during the analysis of the permanent exhibition and confirmed in the observation of the activities of the students in the museum, which had to do with what was kept outside the framework of memory proposed by the institution. What happened before 1973? What was outside the limits of the exhibition? What about human rights in Chile today? So the objects were objectives was to bring up hidden and or absent themes and to expound the time limits of the museum. Within the group, there was a concern for the current human rights situation in Chile. The object images expanded the time limit of the end of the dictatorship and made us rethink the political violence from a vision of the present. They sign out through their photographs that today the government and Chilean society has a debt with the indigenous Mapuche people of southern Chile, whose rights are not respected. The Mapuche have fought since the Spanish conquest to recover their lands and currently are systematically repressed by the police to silence their demonstrations and prevent their territorial claims. So memory does not have an ideal or pure character, nor do the museum structures that seek to portray it. They were related to images in the laboratory workshop and the contents addressed in the sessions, which examine visual material, allowed for an interruption of the display proposed by the museum, by accounting for the absences, paradoxes, conflicts, and tensions, by updating the stories about the past, the montage, and other that was initially presented to us as a concluded, was dismantled and re-politicized. For Didi Uberman, it is not only the images, but also the display, which established the position of each image with respect to the others, and of all images with respect to history. So just to end, it was very important, the writing process about these images that took place, a reflective writing process, which was derived also from common spaces of talking about what we were doing, and to building this open narrative from different points of view from all the participants, where each had the voice and was encouraged to talk about what they were seeing, feeling, and also photographing. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Jose. So I'm going to ask everyone maybe just to turn on their camera so we can have the gallery mode. We have received several questions. Thank you everyone for this insightful morning. I think we receive a lot of questions, and I think we kind of cover a lot of aspects in how photography can be developed in different educational settings. If the gentleman here doesn't mind, I would like to start with a question for Maria Jose. I mean, I think what you said is really important, particular to me, because this is part of my PhD dissertation as well. Working about memory, I think, for example, the social and political movements of the late 20th century, as well as the emerging, I think, of new trends in contemporary museology, had favored the creation of these dedicated places to work with memory. And especially in South America, I'm thinking about Colombia, because this is, of course, a place that I know well, but also Spain. And I guess that they like to commemorate these great tragedies of human history, in particular the Holocaust, we know, with the Nuremberg and Tokyo processes against crime, the genocides, the Second World War. And these institutions have found in art, and in particular here photography, a good way to really maybe work with these very difficult topics, and how they develop pedagogical tools, and how photography is helping here a lot in that sense. You mentioned actually Doris Salcedo, and I don't know if you know the work that she developed, Fragmentos.
No.
This is actually an interesting piece that she developed, because she used 37 tons of weapons turned over the guerrilla, the FARC, and that were melted down by ladies, I mean, a group of people, women that were sexually abused by these people. And she created this counter monument about memory. And they only see, when you enter the space, it's an empty block, it's a cube, and it's white, but they only see, the piece actually is is the floor. And then now they invite a lot of people to work, a lot of artists to contribute to that, and of course, photographers. And my question to you here was a little bit more about, how do you, as someone that works with a museum, set up learning outcomes? And how, when you work with these people, what are your expectations with these people when they come to the museum to use photography, and how they can just take something out of that, working with this such a horrible topic that was, for example, the dictatorship in that you mentioned as well. So I was interested to know a little bit more about the other side, with the people that participated in this project.
Yes, it was for me. I was very curious about this new generation because when I was at school, we were not learning about this period. It was absent. So everything I had learned was about documentary films, Patricio Guzmán, Battle of Chile, and this kind of content. And I was curious about if they know about this, if they care about this. So the invitation for this project was very open, and it was also present as they were learning technical things about photography, but to talk about the relationship with the past. So the group that arrived was very diverse. There were people that had no interest in politics or in history, and others that had very traumatic experience with dictatorships in their families. So it was very interesting to have them talking together. And they were also coming from different parts of Santiago, some of very poor places and other from very wealthy places. So it was a very powerful encounter between them and also with the guides and the people of the museum. And also the guides helped me a lot because they were working in this very difficult place, and they have a lot of visits of schools with, I don't know, 30, 40 young people, children, and they just talk, they see their faces, but it was difficult to have like something more too deep in this content, no? So we were all part of this moment of a very important talk about the past. And also what was very interesting is that they made a lot of connections with the present, and not only with Mapuche problems, but also with the problems of the privatization of health and also education and the difficult life for Chilean people now, social injustice. And it was very interesting because I was invited last week by the museum because they made a balance or a review of the, because the museum exists since 2010. So it was the 10th anniversary. And they say, Maria, please come and talk about your project, because many of the things we talk with the young people and the photos they made are very connected with Chile now, no? And with the social upheaval from last year. And it was interesting to see that they were very conscious and critical young people. And it was for me very rich to work with them, and also to see that Chile had changed a lot, because I lived for a long time, for 10 years in Europe, and also about the experience with these people. I thought, no, I want to be in Chile now, because things are happening, are changing, people are talking and want to change and go forward with not leaving the past away, but confronting it and changing what we don't like from this heritage from Pinochet.
Thank you. We had two questions on what you just said. I mean, Somersault asked if were these children related to the desaparecidos, the disappear? And the other question is for Mark Skoku. What are your thoughts about the new regulations about street photography in France? I don't know if you know about that. And in a way, forbid publication of photos of police in action.
Yeah, very short to finish. One of the girls, Maria, she was from a family that was where are some disappeared people, and where for her it was very important, this project, to have a place to talk about their family, about things she had never talked. And also when I asked them to bring objects, she brought, for example, many books that they had hidden in the ground, under the ground of the yard, not to be persecuted and to not have evidence of this political content in their home. So it was very interesting. And also many of the parents talked to me and said, it was the first time I talked with my child about this, so thank you. It's important to develop this kind of project where art can mediate and help us to talk about that. Yeah. Thank you.
And the other question about, I don't know if you're familiar with that, or maybe this question could be open to all of you, is about what's going on right now about street photography in France, where there is this new law that prohibits the communication of those images where you can identify the faces of the police force. And we forbid publication, and you can actually get sued if, for example, the police can get because we used to get cases where the forces were identified by people, and then there were contact on social media, and they received some messages. And so I don't know if maybe any of you would like to comment about that general comment on street photography and how, you know, this could be maybe allowed or not. I mean, because you're also in different parts of the world.
Shall I respond? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. Well, I think it's a difficult situation, and perhaps I don't know the full extent of the regulation in France. But it's not unusual to have regulations around where and who you may photograph. So all around the world, I think there's certain questions around metro systems and places of security. But I think if we really think about that, it's, you know, we live in a space of surveillance where there is an authority looking after us or looking at us. And so there's the question, why it cannot be reciprocated? Why can I not look similarly? And understanding that individuals are perhaps subjects of authority rather than the authority themselves. Of course, there are questions around their safety. But of course, I think there are larger questions because these questions around who's in control of commercially owning the image, eventually the authority behind it, is perhaps something else. So I'm thinking around kind of commercial institutions that own people's faces by mere registration. A lot of the banks may check your face, may use public information. And so there's a question around surveillance in general. I think one needs to see it as a step, and one needs to kind of caution that the one thing follows the other. So as a single regulation, perhaps it is not that disturbing, but one perhaps should see it within a larger context of different laws. I always appreciate a law that used to be a problem for photographers in Zimbabwe. It basically said that you are not allowed to loiter, and this means hanging around without purpose. And so photographers were often arrested by the Mugabe regime because they were loitering. And the idea of definition of loitering, of course, stretches and go very far. And so I think as a single law, of course, it sounds quite absurd. But if you understand the state mechanisms of control, then it becomes quite clear what the purpose of this is. And so I think for me, it's one law within a purpose, and that purpose becomes clear when you start to look at other laws.
Thank you, John. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything, or I do have another question for you, John, a little bit going back to, we were talking about with Maria about the audience and the people that participate. And we talked before about the curriculum and the importance of maybe changing or updating or kind of reviewing or shifting the curriculum or looking at the curriculum from a different perspective. And you mentioned two things that actually I agree with, and I would like to hear more about how do you think we should cultivate in a classroom empathy and engagement, or even in the curriculum. And I ask you this question because I know where you're located. I know what type of difficulties, maybe technical difficulties or maybe institutional difficulties you could face because of the lack of access to many things. But despite of all that, you still manage to actually help and walk these younger generations into something. And this is a great idea that one of the winners of this year actually comes from South Africa. I mean, he was trained in South Africa in this institution. So I think I would like to hear a little bit more, maybe that approach, if you already include that empathy and engagement in that process. And if not, what would be your advice for us as institutions to maybe think about that?
Well, I can only share one as of many, and I hope my other colleagues can also contribute. I suppose, you know, over the years, I think the most effective way of getting people to understand how their pictures work is when it's pictures of self, when it's pictures of home. When you see yourself in a picture, most of the time your empathy might be a little bit strengthened. And so very early on in curriculum, I think it's essential that people start to photograph own self, their homes, people that they love, and start to put them on the walls. Because that kind of creates an awareness for those photographers to start to think about how does it feel when people are discussing people that you love. I think that's really important. I think, as Maria had mentioned, this idea of memory is also something quite important. So when we start to look at pictures of our own memory, then it starts to shift our thinking around what the picture might mean and what it possibly can say to others. And I think that's really important. But there's also, you know, a lot of other techniques and things that are often used, is this idea of countering that you've mentioned, and that is when you have to speak on behalf of, even if it's not your community, even if it's not photographs of you, setting up debates where people have to or where they are encouraged to think on behalf of others. So it's this idea of gaze. Can I think of my own gaze? Can I think of how I photograph? And I think this empathy perhaps should be for us that have a gaze, that struggle to contain our own gaze without that kind of vulnerability. And I think, of course, very important in any working group, you have to have diversity. You have to have people coming from different places, gender, sexuality, and that diversity in itself brings an awareness, a constellation of debate that I think otherwise would not be possible. But I think that often it is also about photographers being taken seriously. And so you can fool around a lot, and you can take a lot of pictures where you know, you can show your pictures and you don't have any feedback. But once you get feedback on photographs that is critical, you start to think about not only empathy, but also questions of your own reputation. How do you set yourself out there? And I think social media is a very important tool to manage that aspect.
Thank you, John. And in that same line, I would like to ask a question about, so the curriculum will receive a question for Steve and Lucas about the notion of deconstruction, but I don't think Steve talked about it. I think it was more Lucas who talked about deconstruct the curriculum and maybe address new ways of, or new elements to the curriculum. But so I've got two questions maybe that could respond or go in that sense. Would be, Steve mentioned something about we cannot communicate anymore with images. Or if we do, the audience actually does not care anymore about it. So I think maybe here the question will be for you to develop a little bit more about the thinking device. You mentioned about that thinking device, and maybe this is the way we deconstruct the conventional photography. And maybe for Lucas, if you could develop a little bit more on that notion, because I know that you talked a lot about it. And if you could maybe end it up by telling us a little bit more, and I just here connect a little bit and go back to the first question that I asked to Maria. It's about the audience. Since you were working with students, is why do you think, and what was the feedback that why the students are interested today in 2020 to go back to alternative photo processes and understand photography as a, you know, kind of a historical process, mechanical, chemical process, why this is important today to these younger generations? Steve, if you want to start maybe with the thinking device, or maybe reframe the deconstruction notion in your...
Okay. Well, let me go quickly back to George Orwell 1984 novel, because what John has just mentioned with the problem of surveillance in society. Well, this was very much well depicted. You know, the novel of Orwell was exactly a portrait of a totalitarian society at the time when there were no computers at all, no internet, and no cameras whatsoever. So, and that novel should, if we reread today that novel, it reveals and it should make us all think about that the way we perceive technology. Is technology working toward moral good, or it can also facilitate something more evil, like what probably is happening in France? So this is my answer to the previous question. But starting from here, then let's go to move forward with the idea I've expressed before, when I provocatively said that we cannot speak through images anymore. Well, somehow Lucas in his speech has talked about this, you know, when we take pictures, actually, we are writing, we are using codes, we are using machine. My point was a little bit different from the construction. My point is more about relating to the language. So we use, well, I'm saying that as now we are looking and talking each other, actually we are talking to image of ourselves, right? So what's happening is that if more and more the image through technology becomes our own voice, then practically we are not, you know, we are not speaking, it's technology speaking for us. So I know it's very conceptual, but it's actually what is happening. You know, in this moment, there's a technology speaking from me, right? Are we all aware of this? Because if not, we are not truly understanding the scenario we're facing. So this is my thing. The fact is, as much as the audience is conditioning our image, ourselves, or the image we build of ourselves, then we are not speaking through images. You know, it's the image that speaks for us, and that's why I've quoted Heidegger when, in the 1950s, he formulated the language speaks thinking device, saying that language speaks for us because we are not using words that we have invented. So basically, we are using invented words. So actually, it's the language that spoke us. In the same way, machines are spoken as today. So this paradoxically is pushing us to a limit where actually we are not speaking through images anymore. We are spoken by images, and which the risk behind this, I guess, but it's not just me, of course, is the fact that if our image is a likable image because it's driven by the audience, and the fact that we all have to appear and be, you know, accepted out there into the game, what I've called the open prayer of internet, which is the game we play today, and we are playing now. We have been playing the past 2 days with this conference. So this is my concern. If our image has to be a likable image, then it's not us that's speaking anymore. Of course, it's very conceptual, it's very radical, but you know, radical position an extreme position can help us to focus on the scenario. That was my point. I hope I've been a little bit more clear now.
Yeah, I'd like to start by connecting what you quoted from Heidegger, because I think that we can connect a bit like what Flusser says about how he differentiates technical images from traditional images. Oh, am I okay? The way he differentiate those two is that in traditional images, for example, a painting, what we have to decode is usually the mind of the painter, and like to see how they got there and how they painted such a thing. And with photography, what he says is that since it's a technical image, we need to actually decode the device. So similar to what Heidegger was saying, I think in photography, we're also being spoken by the image, but not only the image, but also the camera, because there's a program there, you know, that is written by a brand. If it's like a Canon or a Nikon or any of these huge camera brands today, you know, we're actually being spoken by these cameras. And I think that it's important to kind of like take a deconstructive approach with students, because I think that a lot of them come into photography, and definitely myself included when I was a student, as with this this approach that I think most people have of like photography being a kind of truth, which I think we kind of evolved, you know, both in photography and cinema, we evolved from it being a scientific novelty, then to being this tool to document things and to tell the truth. And then around the 60s or 70s, I particularly learned that from Susan Sontag of, you know, that there is like manipulation in photography, and we're choosing how to frame certain things, and you know, it's not as true as we think. And in cinema, I think the same thing happened. And I think it's important to take a deconstructive approach of telling students, okay, you're creating images, but there's like this tool behind it that has a text written in to create such images, and so I think it's important to demystify photography in some sense, and not to create an illusion like we have in cinema as well. So I think, to me, like, this deconstructive approach is important in order to like demystify photography. But I also think that that's an approach that is maybe that can't really be applied to every student and photographer, because I think ultimately it will depend a bit on the work. I think some of them require a suspension of disbelief that could be affected by this deconstruction. So I think these are kind of my general ideas. I hope I wasn't too confusing.
Thank you, Lucas. I think John wants to add something.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I think that there's a lot to say about technology becoming a kind of instrument that somehow interprets what we are saying and how it speaks on our behalf. But I'm also wondering if, you know, we certainly know this, but in the history, this kind of language that the camera uses is also one of the authority of conventions. And certainly in the history of objection, of suppression, of oppression, it is not new that the camera is being used in such a way. And so I'm thinking that between this idea that we are very concerned about the technology that might distract us, I'm also very worried about the ideas of relationships, how those are at play. And so in the larger picture, technology is a tool, and it certainly remains a very complicated tool, because that tool has got an ownership, and the tool somehow belongs to those that have got the money in capitalist society, and creates all kinds of hierarchies. But the language, which is also part of that tool, is something that perhaps is more democratically owned. And perhaps the language is still the concern, even with the new tool. So these things can never be separated from each other. And so even though the tool might be speaking to us, the tool also uses conventions. And the conventions are the ones that are the politicized ones that come from previous tools. Sometimes that for me is quite important to remember.
Thank you, John. I think that Pedro wanted to say something, and maybe I could jump and add you a question so you can maybe answer the question after. I was thinking about what Lucas was talking about deconstruction, then what John said about the technology. And so I'm trying to link what it is to what was said at the beginning of Pedro's presentation. And I know that you cannot predict the future, but I mean, do you think because of the COVID situation, people will be more interested or will lean more into something that would be online programs or online maybe degrees? Because I mean, as institutions, and I think you and I actually went through a lot of changes and a lot of difficult times to adapt the curriculum to something that was not our expertise. And somehow we have to still remain competitive and deliver those learning outcomes, immediate learning outcomes, despite all this craziness and the tool that, that we see sometimes at the beginning, we saw it as something that was distracting everyone and the curriculum and how difficult. So we have to come up with new ways, of course, of meeting the same outcomes in another way or from another perspective. So I know that that you have some experience in the online learning as well and teaching, because this is what you do in SHIFTA. So maybe if you want to maybe comment on that, and of course, I think you had something to say about the deconstruction.
Yeah. Okay, no, just before I answer this question, if I may, I might disagree partly with Steve and Lucas, following what was John saying. I think I find sometimes difficult to focus and to think on technology. I think we should be at this time, at this moment of history and photographic history, we should be over technology. I think we should take care about what we can do with images and what images do, and what John was saying about relations between different images and different disciplines. So it is true that I think we still have to pay that price of talking about technology. But if you look at other disciplines, they don't have been talking that much about technology as we have been doing in photography since it was invented. No, Lucas was talking about painting. Well, I can't imagine any debate about painting talking about the tools. Obviously, I know we can't compare, a brush with a camera, or maybe we can. It's not about what the machine does. No, I try to teach my students that, they shouldn't care at all about technology, and obviously taking images with a phone or with an iPad or with a large format camera produces a completely different type of images. But it's not about the type of images, but about what we want those images to be and to say and to do, and the reaction from that. So I disagree partly with that. And then following to your question, Klaus, well, actually, I don't know. I think what COVID has done that's my feeling, to distant learning is to put ourselves in I don't know, in 5, 6, 7 years time. So because we all have been doing this learning, teaching through this COVID pandemic, and obviously there are very good things about that, and obviously also very negative aspects of that type of learning. But I don't think it will substitute on-campus learning, but I think is here to stay, and to stay for a long time, and probably also some other types of learning that we are starting to experiment as blended programs, in which you have part on campus and part online. Now, for example, we have discovered how easy it is to invite a lecturer who is in New York and don't having to pay a plane ticket. And you easily could have potentially any teacher from any country of the world with a minimum cost. So I think online teaching is here to stay, as I say, and also because, or I feel that many people are the traditional way of going to university, and here maybe we should difference between undergraduate and postgraduate, which I think are quite different approaches. But mainly in postgraduate, this is what we do, or what I do in ELISAVA and in SHIFTA. Many students, they don't have full time to give you to study the program, and maybe they want to continue with their careers and they want to do other things at the same time they take a postgraduate program. So this distance or online programs allow them to do that, no? to be, maybe even in Barcelona, we have, I was saying that before, we have in SHIFTA, we have students who live in Barcelona, and ELISAVA is in Barcelona, and they could easily take the on-campus program, but they choose to take the SHIFTA program, online program, because they want to keep on with their lives, or maybe they can compromise every single afternoon. Then don't forget the money. It's cheaper to study online than to study, not that much, but it is cheaper because obviously there are other costs. It was, I don't know if you heard, that huge controversial in the States. Harvard University decided to go online with all the programs this year and charging exactly with the same fees than the year before, exactly the same. So it costs you exactly the same, probably obviously by being. So yeah, that's what I feel. I think it's not just the only future, but it is a future on online teaching and learning for sure.
Thank you, Pedro. So we have received several questions as well. I don't know, Steve, you had something do you want to add quickly to this so we can move to the questions? You're muted.
Here I am. Sorry. So I was just quickly feel to answer to Pedro because I'm actually agree with his thought. I remember last year conference in Venice. Pedro had brought the example of that fashion industry, Zara, if I don't remember well, and Zara now makes the photo studio through robots instead of humans, right? So that example was a very good example. That remind us a thing. The first thing, it reminds that we are our history, as I said in my speech, is a history of tools. Actually, we are an instrumental animal, basically. That's what differentiates us from other animals. So we use tools. So all our history is a history of tools, and the camera is just another tool. What I think is interesting, but we have to consider this history, is that we reach a point where actually we are not using technologies, it's technology that are using us. This is the historical change, and we have to understand this. I give you a very short example. When you are posting picture on Instagram or on Facebook, you are not using Facebook, Facebook is using you. So this is the twist, right? That's why the conclusion of my speech was about the need to introduce an ecology of seeing, which brings in ethics and which brings those 4 directions that I had mentioned. So, bottom-up approach with local citizens and the other 3 directions I had mentioned. So anti-colonial approach to curatorial processes, and the other ones, right? But it all starts from this. So I totally agree that we live, I mean, we are an instrumental animal, so we don't have to talk about technology because we are that type of animal. But there is this twist in history that actually it's technology which is using us now, which makes the game a little bit different. So this was my, just to, conclude on, otherwise it sounds like I missed the speech, the very important part of my speech, that was this one.
John, do you wanted to say something?
I suppose, it links very well to your previous question. And so in any war, you would fight with some kind of weapon, and choosing the weapons of war is the kind of democratic solution, right? You can choose, we can agree to which weapons we will fight with. And this is perhaps what's happening in France, is that the choice of weapons are now restricted. You may not photograph police.
Thank you, John. We have been receiving a lot of questions. So if, I don't know, Lucas, you wanted to say something quickly?
Yeah, I just want to add another thing about tools. Like, for example, John, what you were saying about the tools of a war, for example, I think it's interesting to think about how specific cameras have helped in social documentary photography. For example, having smaller cameras, both in film and in photography, have helped people get like closer to their subject, because like we can't really imagine someone just like lugging around a large format camera to, I don't know, take pictures of a war. Of course, that has happened before, but you know, like the advent of like 35mm cameras and point and shoots have just like made it so much easier to like document certain things, which I think is also like a little bit of a point of like my lectures, is like thinking about the camera before the subject to see if like that some of like the functions of the camera can inspire the creation of a concept. Because I do agree with Pedro. I think that at the end, like it doesn't matter the camera as long as like as you can convey your message at the end. But I think thinking about it before can bring in some interesting concepts to a subject.
Thank you, Lucas. So we have been receiving a lot of comments and questions on YouTube. And I think that some of the, a very nice way that described this session this morning, someone said that it's an ecology of seeing, that was mentioned by Steve, but also we're actually trying to talk about the interdisciplinary way of looking. So as I think it's quite interesting. And when we think about photography a century ago, it was a very specific field. And now today, when we talk about image making, photography image making, we need to include other fields to the conversation, such as sociology, anthropology, politics, economy. And when this question, actually, we have received several questions, so I'm trying to group them actually in one because we're running out of time. It was a little bit more about the education system, the educational system. So because someone says that artists are born artists, but education can enable them to transmit their artistry to others, just as language enables us to transmit our thoughts. Do we all think that artistry can be transmitted? If yes, is education a fundamental way for this? And maybe if you have some examples, that would be a good way to illustrate. I don't know who wants to respond to that question.
So perhaps, just to start it off, I think, so the real question for me is, what is an artist? What does an artist do? And so what are these kind of qualities of an artist when they are born or when they are there? Because I think that's somehow how I see an artist. So an artist is not one singular being, it is a multiple being. Some of them are more playing with form, some of them are more interested in content. And so this idea of a singular understanding of what an artist does or who an artist is, I think is perhaps the first question. Sorry, there's an alarm. I hope you can still hear me. I think so. When we think about what people are learning and who they are at the age of, say, 15, 16, 18, I think a lot of what we have said earlier is that people, the choice of photography, the choice of any career is a lifelong becoming. It is not something that I think you just are. You become at various stages with more focus on one aspect and later on another aspect. And I think as this organically develops, you would become an artist at the end. So I don't know if I agree with this idea of a singular type of being an artist. I think that once we can define art, which is already quite a difficult notion, to define what is an artist beyond that is quite difficult. And again, my special example in South Africa certainly would be how photography has developed. If we look at people, well, let's call it the struggle photographers, people that come from a tradition of photojournalism, rather social documentary as a way to resist the state and resist expression. Are they artists or are they activists? And that's been a very long discussion in South Africa as an example of how complicated this sometimes is.
There is also a question about, I think here the question was more about artists, not artistry itself, but more about the artist and what the artist communicates and emits. And so what do you think of the much spoken thought that our thoughts are limited by our vocabulary? I question that is my idea. Sorry, it disappeared. The question disappeared. So what do you think? What do you think of the much spoken thought that our thoughts are limited by the vocabulary we use? So the question disappeared, and now I just have a wrong question. I don't know.
Well, maybe I can say something about that. I tried.
You received the question as well?
No, I haven't, but I think I understand where it's pointing at. I mean, let's think about studies of anthropology has proved that indigenous people had much more words than us in their vocabulary, basically. So if the number of words you use describe our world, basically, because we describe the world through our words, our vocabulary, then their world was much bigger than ours. So they have like different names to tell how the winds were flipping through the leaves. And so they have many colors, like in a palette. To compare, they had much more colors than we had today. So shifting from words to colors, to simplify. So I guess this is the point then. As an artist, you probably want to expand your vocabulary, your number of words, or your number of colors. So be at least aware about the infinite possibility of palettes and colors, so that your world is bigger. I guess this is the basic assumption. I don't know, but I don't know if I have answered to the question because I haven't read it.
Well, disappeared anyway.
Disappeared.
So maybe since
sorry, Klaus, about disappearing. The fact that when the words disappear is actually happening to our vocabulary, then what is disappearing with us is also the world. Finish.
Thank you, Steve. So maybe we could all say something about. There is a last comment that was made on what Pedro said. There is a lot of effort for making a lecture from our faculty, and that has doubled with these new online platforms. So so maybe if you have, because we have thought about institutions, about people, about different communities, different issues as well, the medium as well. But I think we forgot here today, and I think there is still time to talk about it, is for these faculty members or these instructors, workshop instructors, or these people that deliver this curriculum. And I think we can, of course, produce some projects and drop some curriculum and curricula in general. But I think it's we need to think about what are the tools, and someone mentioned weapons before, what we are giving those tools to these instructors to really deliver that message and really equip our future generations to do that. And I personally also, my classes actually were shifts online, and it represents, of course, a lot of more work. And I guess we were not trained to do that work. And maybe, we can start with Pedro, and if any of you have some experiences or maybe thoughts about how we're going to face that in the future, maybe some advices. I see that some faculty, actually, they're here as well as part of the audience.
Well, I start if you want. I think we have to make a difference here between what we have been doing or some of you. I'm not doing online teaching now because the COVID. I'm doing online teaching as online teaching. But what we have all done through the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe was not online teaching. Was just trying to, okay, let's see what we can do and how we can do it as soon as possible. So we continue with our programs. We were in the kind of the last part of the program, so we tried to do what we could, and probably in many cases doing the same that we would have been doing on a campus based, but online through a computer, getting all the students together at the same time and delivering some lectures and then sending to them as many exercises as we could. So we felt, or this is how we felt in ELISAVA, that if we send the students as many tasks as possible, we felt we were doing our jobs. And I think actually that's a big mistake. That's one of the first mistakes we have done several years, and now I think we are doing that right in terms of thinking that, okay, in an online structure, we send as many tasks and as many projects as possible. So, you know, the students, they have lots of things to do. And this is not about quantity. I think you were saying about tools. There are plenty of tools. There are so many tools that you cannot use all of them to give you different resources to do different and to approach differently lectures. And maybe lectures are not lectures anymore. We do lectures on live lectures, and then we record some lectures. But the process of learning in an online system is not based on the lecture. It's based on the independent study. Is based on the relationship between the lecturer and the student. Is based on the tools that you use, and it's based mainly on how you do these things. And we use tools for do some gamification and try to emulate some gaming, but through the projects and with these master classes and with these micro learning pills that we send to the students constantly, sometimes through the campus, but sometimes through WhatsApp or Facebook or Instagram or Telegram or Snapchat or any media. So it's a very diverse way of sending to the student the information, and the student has several opportunities and different ways of getting into that. You know, even very practical, you know, very practical materials as for example lighting. No, how do you do lighting? How do you do studio practice in an online form? Well, we do. There are now these days these simulators. I mean, people studying medicine use simulators to have these practices in hospitals. So it's exactly the same in photography. It's not the same, obviously. It is not the same. It is not the same. It is an online or a distant learning program, but we cover pretty much the same that you would cover in a on-campus program, obviously differently, with also that with a different with different timings. You know? The time that online student has to be able to study is completely different to a full-time on-campus student. So you have to adapt. And sorry, I just finished. And the most important thing that we have learned through these years is to just go to the really, really, really important stuff and get away of what it is accessory and that you don't really need and the student doesn't really need. And you go right to the point. Sorry.
No, it's a question about what you were saying about the, you know, we still do the job and we still actually do it differently, but the job is prepare, is deliver. So I'm just going back to what we said about the Harvard University, that they were applying the same tuition fee. So do you think that we should do the same because the work is prepared?
No, because well, in Harvard, I think it's obviously because reputation and all of that, but I don't think people are prepared to pay the same tuition fees than on a campus based. No way. No, because you don't have, you do have more cost in labor, in preparing and getting everything ready, but also you spend less money in terms of installations and equipment and all the stuff. So here in our case, and I think in most of the cases, is cheaper. It's like 30-40% cheaper an online course than an on-campus.
Thank you, Pedro. I don't know if anyone wants to conclude with something because we're just run out of time. And I think, Maria, you want to say something?
Yes, I want to comment on my faculty. I'm teaching in audiovisual new school in southern Chile. And it has been very interesting because we have been adapting very fast to what is happening. And we at the beginning, we didn't knew what tools have the students to continue with this online studying, because we thought they had all internet, but they hadn't, that they had all a cellular phone. Not all of them had, not all of them. A lot of them were following the course in their phone and not in their computer. So it was very important to see what they had and how the university could help them. Many of them, they abandoned. And we also had this, we were like very stressed in the beginning and said, no, we have to give them a lot of things to do. The same, they are at home, they have a lot of time, but some of them are working, or I am more on the theoretical courses. So they say, no, we don't make practical, give them a lot of readings, but they were reading on the phones. So we were, for us, it was very important to open the dialogue with them, also with the students, to see what was possible to make, and also to share experience between the different academics and professors to see what was working, what not, how to follow their processes of learning. And now, on the end of the year, we're making also a conference where we want to share how to create and how to teach in times of crisis. Also to share experience, I think it's very interesting, and also international experiences, and see how we can follow with something that will continue for a time.
Thank you, Maria Jose. I think we can maybe end with that feedback from another continent. From the South, I think it's important to receive this feedback and learn from what other institutions are doing, because I think this is an unprecedented situation for a lot of us. And I think it seems to be continuing at least for a couple of months. I would like to invite everyone to come back at 2:30 for the professional learning settings section that will start at 2:30. We're going to start with the launching of the catalog of the 2020 edition. So we will have the 3 curators with us, and I think we will have also many of the finalists and winners. But also there will be a lot of interesting case studies from institutions, collectors, and other initiatives, private and public. And I think it would be interesting to have maybe another perspective and how this is photography and education are also getting influence and are influencing the other institutions. A big thank you, a special thank you to all the speakers this morning. I think it was a very interesting morning. We received a lot of questions, and people were engaging a lot in the chat. Thank you very much, and I'll see you everyone at 2:30 this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.